Hi, I'm Liz Bernson from the CPA Journal. This is the latest in our series on sustainability from the voices of the profession.
For a long time, most people would agree that the true language of business is accounting. After all, the story of any company, no matter its size, its industry, or the country of its origin, is usually told through its financial records and reports. But in recent years, capital market stakeholders are finding it increasingly valuable when companies provide sustainability information on the environmental, social, and governance issues that have an impact on their businesses. After all, the globalization of and interdependencies in supply chains, along with population shifts, are having an impact on the quality, availability, and price of most resources. So stakeholders, along with investors and regulators, are increasingly considering internal and external non-financial factors such as resource scarcity or demographic shifts when they assess an enterprise's long-term prospects. According to the latest statistics, 85% of the nation's largest public companies reported on climate change, diversity, and other sustainability issues in 2017.
It's not only investors and regulators who are seeking increased sustainability information. Recent studies point to widespread acceptance of and demand for the data in the boardroom and the C-suite. With us is Tim Mohin, Chief Executive of the Global Reporting Initiative, known as GRI, which helps businesses and other organizations understand and communicate their impacts on issues from climate change to diversity. He tells us who is the audience for sustainability reports in general and for GRI reports in particular.
The audience for GRI reports is very, very broad. It can include employees, shareholders, and investors, and corporate management. Often we think about it as just for activists and that kind of thing, but we've actually done a study to show that over the last 7 years, GRI is the most referenced ESG standard in financial reports. In actually regulatory required financial reports, GRI is the most referenced ESG standard. So we are, in fact, working to make sure that our materials, the disclosures, are relevant to the financial sector. The United States is our largest market by far. We have the largest number of GRI reporters headquartered in the United States. And so other regions are coming up fast. I would say the Asian region is our fastest growth region. But in terms of adoption of the GRI standards, use of the GRI standards to disclose information, North America is our biggest market.
Most accountants can tell you that double-entry bookkeeping originated in the 15th century with Luca Pacioli. But Tim Mohin's explanation that sustainability reporting can trace its roots to the Exxon Valdez oil spill of 1989.
So if you know the Coalition on Environmentally Responsible Economies, or CERES, they started off from the Exxon Valdez spill back in 1989. And as CERES kind of got going, there was a need to provide corporations with some definition of what are we asking them to convey to the world, to be transparent about. And that gave birth to the Global Reporting Initiative in '97. And then subsequent to that, GRI sort of came onto the scene, and a lot of companies were trying to express their bona fides in terms of what are they doing for the environment, what are they doing for people, and GRI basically set that standard. So GRI has a number of standards in that place for disclosure about intellectual property, intellectual capital, ethics, corruption. All of those things are within our standard set. So again, it helps companies not only to report on those topics, but by reporting on them, you're digging deep and looking at your systems, processes, and policies to manage those issues.
Similar to when the AICPA split off the Accounting Principles Board to set the standards for accounting, the GRI standards are now developed by the Global Sustainability Standards Board.
So recently, actually in 2014, GRI went through a major change to split off the standard-setting organization from what we call the Secretariat. The Secretariat is sort of the coalition or community of practice, if you will, for corporate sustainability officers who are in fact involved in reporting. And we provide them a membership and we provide them services and those kinds of things. On the other side of the firewall that we deliberately set up is the standard setting organization. And it's deliberately split off in our governance so that it can't be impacted by any of the revenue services that I spoke about. On that side of the firewall is an independent, multi-stakeholder standard setting board of about 15 individuals that come together to set not only the full range of standards that we have, but then they go individual standard by standards. And now GRI sets standards. And these standards are the most widely adopted sustainability reporting standards in the world.
Essentially, the current 33 GRI sustainability standards are divided into 4 groups. The 100 series includes 3 universal standards that are applicable for every organization preparing a sustainability report. The 200 series of GRI standards include topic-specific standards used to report information on an organization's impacts related to economic topics. And the 300 series topic-specific standards report information related to environmental topics. And the 400 series social standards report on issues from occupational health and safety to child labor.
First of all, it's important to understand, what it is we're actually putting forward. So the 100 series is about your company's management approach and its governance bodies and those kinds of general questions. And then we have topic-specific standards on economic, environmental, and social considerations. There are 33 of those taken all together. And now we're reviewing the occupational safety and health standard and the water standard, and those are almost completed. And we just started reviewing the human rights standards. So that's how it works right now. It's independent, multi-stakeholder standard setting body that is separated by a firewall in our governance procedures. And then there are also 10 reporting principles. Probably the one that gets the most attention is our principle of materiality. I know in the financial world, the word materiality has a definition. We have a different definition in the sustainability world. In the financial world, it's what is financially impactful to the company. In the sustainability world is what is the company doing that could be impactful to the world around it. And so they're converse definitions. One is inward-looking and one is outward-looking. And that often confuses people.
Tim Mohin explains how the sustainability concept of materiality could and did affect a company's reporting on its supply chain.
So when we talked about the materiality definition, we specifically refer to defining the boundary conditions on material issues. So if you are an outsourced manufacturer, per your example, you know that many of your labor risks will be in the supply chain, maybe the first tier, maybe even the second tier of your supply chain. So if you follow the principles, the GRI principles, you would call that in scope, in the boundary condition of a material issue. And then very quickly you're down into that supply chain and looking at their employment practices and their management systems to make sure that they avoid those labor issues. So I did work in supply chain for a major electronics firm. And, we did find some labor and human rights issues in those cases. You could ask yourself, from a strict financial view, is that a material issue to the company? Well, the answer would be no, unless it hits the cover of the New York Times, which in fact it did. And so it's having that kind of radar, that sense of what is a potential risk reputationally, or financially, or any other kind of risk that our company should be paying attention to.
Yes, sustainability reporting must be material, but according to Tim Mohin, it must also meet the test of the 4 C's.
So I have my 4 C's of effective reporting. It needs to be concise and current, and those go together because if you're going to do a more frequent disclosure, it has to be shorter, less material. and it needs to be consistent, which GRI offers you because we have the global standards, and it needs to be comparable. So you should be able to compare from one company to another company, especially within a sector. I think that what GRI does is we provide the standards that get companies to actually start looking at environmental, social, and governance issues. Now, applying that to a company's future, what are the risks, what are the opportunities, is where it gets very interesting. And I think that there are different ways of measuring it. For example, one of the largest intangible assets on many companies' balance sheet is their brand. There's a company here in New York City called the Reputation Institute that breaks down the intangible asset called brand into various components. It turns out that roughly about 40% of a brand value is manifest in corporate responsibility, environmental, social, governance. Those risk factors make up nearly half of that intangible asset, which for some of the largest companies in the world is measured in the hundreds of billions. By setting a consistent global framework for what companies should be looking for in the issues of intellectual property, corruption, ethics, and any other of our standards, it helps companies know what questions to ask, what policies to have, what procedures, what management systems to actually manage these issues well.
Viewers may recall that the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board is another independent standard-setting organization, fostering the disclosure of sustainability information for investor needs. Tim Mohin differentiates what GRI does from how the SASB meets investor needs.
So the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, SASB, started in 2011, I think, so they're quite new. In fact, they have adopted a very similar governance model to GRI's, but it's quite recent that they've adopted that independent standard setting model, and they're just now coming out with their standards. And the way they've done it is very different than the way GRI approached it. First of all, when SASB started, they started with the GRI standards, and the differentiation, your question, is the definition of materiality. As I mentioned before, GRI has an outward-looking definition of materiality, which is, what's the impact on the world around the company, as opposed to SASB, which is predetermining for each company in the sector what could be financially material in the short term to that company. And I think that's where, a lot of companies are saying, well, wait a minute, how do I know that that is material for my company? It's hard to predetermine financial materiality because every company is different. So SASB has predetermined what is financially material in terms of environmental, social, and governance issues for each of 79 sectors. And they've defined 5, maybe 7, a very short list of these indicators for each of those sectors. As I said, that is quite new and it's coming out in the near future, but there's not a huge amount of adoption yet on that.
In some enterprises, the Chief Financial Officer also serves as the Chief Sustainability Officer. In other organizations, the Sustainability Director reports to the CFO. According to Tim Mohin, there is no single organizational home for sustainable reporting.
Corporate Sustainability Officer, I think, is a fairly recent evolution of a position within corporations. Now, who is doing that in the company is the question. Companies have typically now started to have corporate sustainability officers or senior vice president or vice president of sustainability. Where do they report? It's all over the map. I had these positions in my past working for Intel, working for Apple, working for AMD. I reported from facilities to legal to, in one case, supply chain. So it can be almost anywhere within the company. It's not standardized. So I mentioned a previous employer, Intel. We published our first report in 1995, and there were a few companies out there doing it at the time, but I'm a fairly old guy, and I remember some of these days that voluntarily disclosing any matter, much less a sensitive matter like environmental issues, was just not something companies did. And so you had a couple of these early movers that were voluntarily trying to tell their story. You also had a few companies that were sort of more pushed. I mentioned the case of the Exxon Valdez. It became the Valdez Principles, which became the forerunner to series in GRI. And so some of the extractive companies were definitely in that mode of being pushed to disclose more back in the early days. So I think the real evolution is to unlock the investment that not only corporations in the U.S., but corporations across the world have made in ESG disclosure. This has been going on for 20 years. I personally have been involved in almost that entire history in developing these reports. I think it works incredibly well inside a company because we manage what we measure. Where we need to go is getting it outside of the company to be used by others, especially in the financial world, in the investment world. And to do that, I think we have to change the way we've approached the topic.
Of course, public companies are generally required to disclose certain risks in their filings, along with Securities and Exchange Commission, as we indicated in last month's programs on cybersecurity incidents and risks. In a similar vein, the SEC has been issuing guidance to help clarify the disclosure requirements for climate-related matters. Besides commission guidance and individual comment letters to specific companies, the SEC has issued 2 reports to Congress examining changes in climate-related disclosure in select industries.
To the extent that companies are providing disclosures to the SEC and investors on environmental, social, and governance issues, it is a major concern for the enterprise's financial executives.
Ultimately, what we're talking about in terms of the theory of change is corporate disclosure. So if you look at it from a very basic point of view, you manage what you measure. And if we're starting to measure a company's impact on environmental issues and social issues, then all of a sudden a light has been shined on those things, and the company will take a look at that and say, we have to get better. If we're going to put this information in the world, somebody's going to look at that, so we have to be better. I think that has a virtuous cycle of improvement that goes along with it, and so I think that accountants can be a big part of that. I know that lawyers get paid to be conservative and to protect the company, and that you can always hypothetically say that by disclosing more, you open to more risk. I mean, it makes sense, but has that actually happened? I would argue the other side of it vociferously because I've lived it, which is if you're not looking at these issues, what risks are you overlooking? What could hurt your company in the long run? So even if you don't disclose it publicly, you should be looking at it at least inside the company to make sure that there aren't any big risks that you're overlooked.
And any time that data is disclosed to regulators and other stakeholders, financial executives are logically concerned about the reliability and accuracy of the information. As a result, they often look for and question the need for assurance.
I think that companies, as they start seeing their stakeholders and their investors care more about these kinds of issues, realize that if they're going to put these disclosures out into the world, they have to have something behind it. And so I do see it as a big growth area. Assurance is a weakness. Your data is similar to what we are tracking. Roughly 40% of ESG disclosures are currently assured, and 60% are unassured. And so if we're going to have this transition into financially relevant disclosures, I think we have to up that assurance rate substantially. One of the barriers to that has been a lack of assurance standards in this space. So there are some that are out there. AICPA has developed some guidance in this space, and others as well. But a really exciting new development is the IAASB, the International Assurance Standards Body, is in fact now taking that on and looking at creating an international assurance standard for ESG disclosures. And GRI's position is that we would like to see A, more assurance, and B, more quality of that assurance, because that leads to credibility, which leads to adoption of the actual disclosures and use of them to make change, make better decisions. So we're 100% aligned with getting more assurance, getting more quality of that assurance.
As Tim Mohin notes, it's one thing for a company to have the data, but it may be another matter to translate it into financially relevant information.
What's interesting about the question is, over 20 years, and the adoption rate that we have, there is a mountain of environmental and social and governance information. ESG information is we're awash in supply of information. Where we need to work is on the demand side. And so to answer your question, yes, we are working with the major asset owners on both sides of the Atlantic and also in Asia to get the uptake from that massive supply of ESG information. With a 75% adoption rate for GRI and 92% of the Global 250 already reporting, 85% of the S&P 500 is reporting, we have the supply of information. It's how to translate that information into financially relevant information that can be used by investors. That's really where we need to work.
Oftentimes, managers will criticize accountants for only looking at the historical results in the rearview mirror, while they are busy trying to prepare forecasts and to study the road ahead.
Because if you're driving looking in the rearview mirror, you're going to run into a tree. So it's absolutely critical that companies look ahead and see where these issues could impact them. I think forecasting is incredibly important. As we start to look at this information on environmental, social, and governance, it is things that happened in the past. That's still good information. You can trend it, you can track it, you can compare it. But until we start to forecast, it's very difficult for an investor to say, okay, what's really happening here? It's not too far afield. A company like ours that has the majority of adoption in this industry, I think it comes with a responsibility to make sure that what we're doing actually works for companies. So I think scenario planning, understanding the risks of environmental, social, governance, how does that fit in with a company's product roadmap, with its growth roadmap, with its mergers and acquisitions? Absolutely critical. Now, one of the things that is changing all this is the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosures, TCFD. That's part of an output of the Financial Stability Board. They not only have a series of disclosures on a company's impact on climate change, but they also ask companies to do scenario planning, which is to look at a world that is warmer, has bigger weather events, and how that would impact their company financially. So that's, I think, the first element that we're seeing of looking forward and forecasting what these issues mean for a company.
And looking at the future is the hallmark of another constituency, younger people who are coming into the workforce. According to Tim Mohin, who authored the book Changing Business from the Inside Out, the issues of sustainability have taken on a greater sense of importance for many students and newer employees.
I think that's exactly what I was referring to in terms of some of the younger people coming into the workplace and wanting to have a job that's bigger than their paycheck. And I think accountancies can have a big impact on that. And it has another aspect that I think is worth mentioning. I think many young people that are coming into the workplace are coming in with a sense of purpose, a sense of cause. And by getting involved in some of the issues like environmental and social and governance, you can fulfill that need for some of the millennial employees coming into the workplace. But we're also seeing the GRI being taken up in many business schools across the United States as well. I personally teach in a couple of them. I'll be teaching at Harvard on Monday night and Brandeis the next week on this very topic. So there are quite a few MBA programs that are including a sustainability element.
From climate change risk to diversity, a lot of financial executives are already working on sustainability issues in their enterprises. What was once considered a do-good issue is increasingly becoming a legitimate business concern. In his annual letter, Lawrence Fink, a co-founder, chairman, and CEO of BlackRock, recently reminded the world's largest businesses that if they want BlackRock's support, they need to serve a social purpose. According to Mr. Fink, every company must, quote, not only deliver financial performance, but also show how it makes a positive contribution to society, end quote.
According to Tim Mohin, the letter from BlackRock will likely spark additional corporate soul-searching over the issues of sustainability reporting.
I read a piece in Bloomberg this week where the latest letter from Larry Fink is now going to translate into 20 questions that they will ask their portfolio companies. Hopefully those 20 questions will be aligned with what those companies are already disclosing, which is using the GRI standards. We're starting to see that effect in the U.S. as well. especially as Larry Fink from BlackRock writes his letter that companies really need to have some answers for these questions on ESG. So it's changing fast, and with the adoption rate that we have being the majority of companies using our standards, I think it will become much more of a recognized name outside of the corporate sustainability world.
Of course, much of the data about sustainability is, according to Tim Mohin, public information that is already in the hands of bankers and their clients.
First of all, it's all publicly available information. So a company is putting it out in the public, so there's less privacy concerns already. But there are also multiple organizations that collect and utilize this information. There is an entire industry of investment analysts, the biggest being Morgan Stanley, MSCI, that take ESG information and turn it into analytics for investors. I think we have some work to do before GRI is well known outside of the sustainability officer crowd. And I think some of that is frankly cultural. I worked inside of companies for many, many years, and there is sort of a silo effect. The sustainability crew is working over here, and the financial crew is over here, and there's not much mixing. Now, we're starting to see that break down. It started with the activist shareholders filing resolutions with companies, which started to have those two groups working together. And now it's starting to bleed into the mainstream investors as well.
And in recent years, the investment banking community has shown increased interest in voting in favor of shareholder resolutions that require additional corporate disclosure on climate change and other sustainability issues.
And I think one of the interesting points to also note is the shareholder resolution with ExxonMobil last year on climate change disclosure, which the board actually recommended against, and the institutional investors voted for, and it passed with 2/3 of the shares voting for it. The momentum is there. I mean, typically these shareholder resolutions would attract single digits, low double digits in terms of the actual proxy vote. And this, I think, is a tipping point where you're seeing institutional investors actually voting for additional disclosure on ESG matters. And so you're starting to see some of these larger passive investment houses come into this world, and they're asking the right questions. What's the value? Are we identifying additional risk or value in our portfolio companies when we ask these questions? But just simply by asking the questions, these companies will pay attention and you'll start to see improvement.
But financial executives often look at the bottom line. And for them, the question may be, to what extent is sustainability reporting going to add to our already considerable reporting burden?
Often when I'm speaking about the GRI standards, I hear about reporting burden from the issuers, from companies. And I think it's a real issue. And it's one of the pillars of my 4-pillar strategy, which is we need to reduce the burden. We need to make it more efficient. And I think by making it more efficient, we can make it more effective. So everything from digital reporting to more concise and current reporting is all part of that making reporting more efficient drive. I would like to note that there's nothing in the GRI standards that says companies need to issue a 150-page document with lots of pretty pictures once a year. That is just how the practice has grown up. I think we can turn it into something that's much more efficient, effective reporting. Another issue I get asked a lot about is the fragmentation in the market. There's an alphabet soup of ESG disclosure standards and frameworks out there. And I think that is a very true perception. As I've mentioned several times, the reality is that most companies disclosing this information are using the GRI standards to do so. So if you're roughly at a 75% adoption rate, the reality is that there isn't much fragmentation. But because the perception is out there and because there are other frameworks, and there certainly are, I think it is incumbent upon GRI with the largest adoption rate to harmonize across the market. And so we've reached out to organizations like SASB, like the Integrated Reporting Council, and several others to harmonize our approaches. And it's one thing to say it, it's another thing to do it. And so we have a project right now, a proposal right now, to actually align the disclosure standards between GRI and SASB. And the way it's working is kind of interesting. Since SASB started with the GRI standards, many of them are already aligned. There are some that SASB's added, which is great because it adds to the body of knowledge. But the third category is where we're asking the same questions in annoyingly different ways. And I think we have to get at that third category. And so that is something that is very much a live issue with us, is harmonization across the various disclosure standards that are out there.
GRI's Tim Mohin concludes with a hope that sustainability reporting will aid business decision-making as well as add to investor knowledge and understanding.
Standards can enter the financial world. We believe that's a very good thing, because the more that the financial world and the C-suite and the shareholders and the investors start to see this information, the more it will be used for decision-making, and more that decision-making will align capital to sustainable business practices.